Hello, fellow documentarians. First of all, I'd like to thank Write the Docs for letting me speak after a few years of sending in talk proposals and for maintaining this conference, although unfortunately we still cannot meet in person. I'm Anna Gasparyan, and I'm a product manager at JetBrains. Throughout my career in IT, I have worn many different hats, from technical writer to development lead. I had been in technical writing for 15 years. I have led multiple teams of technical writers in different companies, and my job as a product manager is still closely related to technical writing, as our team is working on a tool for authoring documentation. At JetBrains, we make tools for developers. Our most well-known products are integrated development environments for different programming languages. You may have heard of some of them. So I just want to give you an idea of what our documentation project is like. We have a family of a dozen IDEs based on the same platform called IntelliJ. They all have some common functionality that comes from the platform and a lot of features that are specific to each programming language. All of this dictates the architecture for our documentation project. It has more than a dozen documentation instances built from the same sort of set files with the platform content shared between them with different filters and conditions. And there is a team of about 20 technical writers, all contributing to the same project. Given the architecture of our IntelliJ platform products and the complexity of our documentation project, we know all things related to single source inside out and have fallen into all traps possible with it. So the purpose of this talk is to prevent you from falling into these traps, or if you already have, try and give you a helping hand. Let's start with a brief overview of what topics we are going to cover today so that you know what to expect from this presentation. We are going to have a very quick look at the benefits of single source to make sure we are on the same page as to why you should bother about using it at all. Then we will look at the different types of content reuse, and I will show you some examples based on the IntelliJ documentation. Then we're going to look at the flip side of single source. I have identified 4 problems based on our team's experience, which I have called abuse of reuse, source code reduction, misuse of reuse, and traffic cannibalization. For each of these, we will look at examples, talk about the root cause and the problems that they lead to, and I will talk about possible solutions that we have implemented or that we are working on in our team. And finally, we will sum things up so that you have some practical tips that you can apply to your work. So, single source is a powerful feature that most help authoring tools would list as their top 3 competitive advantages. And for most documentation authors, this is a must-have functionality that they will be looking for in an authoring solution. Most of you are most likely familiar with it, and though the benefits are obvious, I want to briefly list them here. Because if there is just one thing you remember from this presentation, it should be that you should always keep these benefits in mind and ask yourself if you are following these principles when you make a decision about reusing some content. Because if you don't, you may end up falling into one of the pitfalls we will be discussing today. So, single sourcing and reusing technical content lets you maintain consistency throughout your documentation in terms of style, terminology, the level of detail, and so on. It helps you avoid making multiple updates. For example, there is a procedure that describes a user scenario, and that is used in several documentation deliverables. If you don't reuse it from a single source, if the interface changes, you will be forced to make updates in multiple occurrences of this procedure, and chances are high that something will slip out. It helps you reduce on the review and editing effort and on localization costs. If you don't convey the same idea in different words across multiple articles, it will only get reviewed and translated once. And it also helps you automate the routine, because reproducing the same pieces of content repeatedly adds mundane to your work and duplicates the effort. So, what exactly is single source, that is also referred to as content reuse? That, as authoring tools promise you, makes your life so much better. If you look at definitions of what single source is in documentation, you will most likely come across the following statement: write once, publish everywhere. For those of you who are less familiar with what that stands behind this concept, I'd like to break it into two major things. Single source lets you produce multiple outputs from the same source of set files and reuse any size pieces of content in multiple help articles and contexts. Sometimes only the first pattern is referred to as single source, so I just want to stress that we'll be looking at both these types of content reuse. Now, let's visualize the first concept, which is producing different outputs from the same set of source files. This is an example based on the documentation architecture for JetBrains IDEs. In the middle, you see some subset of topics from our documentation project. There is running and debugging, version control, database tools, Java, Kotlin, Spring, Python, scientific tools, and big data tools. The left column shows which of them go into the help for IntelliJ IDEA, and the right which go to PyCharm documentation. As you can see, the green topics are shared between the two instances, and the blue and purple ones are specific to each help instance. That looks pretty simple, doesn't it? So this is about reuse on an article level and building different documentation instances from the same set of source files. But sometimes you also want to reuse a smaller piece of content, like a note or a warning or some conceptual information. So what we do in our project is we put this reusable snippet to a library, assign an ID to it, and then you can include it into multiple articles, like this note on an example telling users that some functionality is limited to the commercial product edition. Like you can see for IntelliJ IDEA documentation, it goes into the topic about Spring, and in PyCharm to scientific tools and big data tools. Still quite simple. Now, what if I told you that in IntelliJ IDEA, the correct term for the commercial version is Ultimate Edition, and in PyCharm, it's called Professional Edition? In this case, you cannot just reuse this node as is. You will need to use some more complicated markup and apply conditions to it. It could look like the following. So you can see that we have condition. If the final output is IntelliJ IDEA, then it should be rendered as ultimate. If it goes to PyCharm, then it should be professional. I'm not sure if you can see my color coding, but you can see there are different shades of yellow to illustrate that the output would be different for the same node under these conditions. On a side note, different authoring tools have different UI for these filters and conditions, and how you can apply them from the interface or the editor. Underneath is usually some XML-based markup, so I'm showing you some generalized examples of what the source markup may look like without being tied to any specific tools. Now, let's go further. In the previous example, the topics where we wanted to include this node were specific to each instance. Now, what if I told you that database tools, which is shared by the two help instances, is also available in the commercial version only? So we need to include it into this topic, and then when this topic is included into each instance, we need to process the source in a way that the output is different. In this case, we would define a variable and set different values for it under conditions. So you can see we define a variable, its name is commercial. You can see commercial is a variable here in the node. And if the product is IDEA, the value is ultimate. If the product is PyCharm, the value is professional. We could go even further because that reusable snippet could be part of another snippet. But then the illustration would end up with something like this. But you get the idea, right? So now you have an understanding of the types of reuse on the article level and snippet level, and how flexible you can get with all the conditions, filters, and variables. And here is where we get close to the first issue, which I call abuse of reuse. As we have seen, tools powered with single source allow you to include reused content under conditions and give you a lot of flexibility. Sometimes too much flexibility, really. Let me show you what I mean. Here is a good example of reusing content with conditions where filters are justified. It comes from our documentation project, and it's for a tip of the day, which is shown in a small pop-up when a user opens an IDE. This one is about code completion, and it says code completion helps you quickly complete code statements. It works as you type and gives a list of suggestions available from the current caret position. The text is common for all products, but screenshots would be different, so they are used under product filters. You see there is an image for IntelliJ IDEA, for PHP Storm, for PyCharm, and for WebStorm. So same text, different screenshots, filters are justified. In the second example, filters are used because programming languages have different components. This one is about finding usages of a code element. And like in Java, you would search for usages of a method. In C++, this would be called a function. And in database tools, you would search for usages of a table, column, or key. So you can see filters here are legit. Now let's look at the third example. This is a tip of the day. It's also about code completion and how you can change the order of suggestions in the pop-up. And it's also got product filters. So for IntelliJ IDEA, it tells you you can sort completion suggestions by relevance or alphabetically. For PyCharm, it tells by default completion suggestions are sorted by relevance, but you can sort them alphabetically by selecting the sort by name option. And for WebStorm, it tells you to choose how you want to sort completion suggestions by name or relevance, toggle the sort by name checkbox. Can you tell me what's wrong with this example, where a tip of the day is supposed to be reused between products and content specific for this product is put under filters? Yeah, right. All three paragraphs here are about exactly the same thing. Actually, if you look at this example, nothing is actually reused at all apart from the title. The only thing different is wording and the level of detail. Now, there are a few reasons why things like that can be found in our documentation sources. Writers think they can come up with better wording than the original piece, but they don't feel comfortable with replacing their peers' work with their variant. Or sometimes writers get affected by feedback from a user who is not satisfied with the level of detail and adds redundant information because then they feel that they have reacted to feedback. Now, do you remember the reasons to bother about content reuse? In this example, you don't maintain consistency. Instead, you convey the same idea in different ways and with different level of detail. You don't avoid making multiple updates, because if, say, the option name changes, you will need to update 2 out of the 3 pieces in this example. You don't reduce on the review or localization costs, as these sentences won't be treated by translation memory as the same piece, and thus will all have to be translated in full. And in no way it helps you automate the routine. Now, let us look at strategies that could help avoid things like that from happening. Years ago, we had multiple examples like this in our sources, and here is what we have done to avoid such abuse of reuse. We have developed an in-house style guide, and in many cases, this helps avoid such abuse of reuse, as there is an agreement as to how much detail we provide, what syntax we use, the tone of voice, and so on. And these are no longer a matter of a writer's personal taste. We have automated checks against our style conventions. So if, say, you use redundant words or parentheses and so on, they will get highlighted in the editor and you will be prompted to rephrase. We have also agreed on the improve for yourself, improve for everyone principle. Our team of writers is a very professional one, so if any of them think that they can improve a piece of writing, they needn't be too sensitive about replacing somebody else's work. We are also working on implementing a syntax checker that would detect not exact duplicates and suggest extracting them to a library so that they can be reused. We already have an MVP version of this linter ready to use, but we are also looking at different approaches that might include technologies like Elasticsearch, machine learning, and so on. Now let us look at our second monster, which is source code reduction. So imagine you have received feedback from a help page and opened it to see what can be improved. So that's quite a long reference topic, that explains dozens of parameters for a run configuration used to run or debug a Java Scratch file. Now, I notice a grammar mistake here in allow parallel run. It says IntelliJ IDEA suggests to stop the running instance, while it should be IntelliJ IDEA suggests stopping the running instance, and I want to fix that error. First, we need to locate this topic in our project. Let's search for Java Scratch. Okay, here we are. Interesting. There is an introduction. Now, how did the rest of that page result from these 2 lines of code? Looks like we will need to do some reverse engineering. Okay, we see that there is an include. So apparently there is a content snippet, there is a stored in a library and reused in this topic. And if we click on the ID, we will jump to the source. Okay. We see that content chunk that is reused, and there is a chapter, and it's called configuration tab. But I think it was called something different on the web. Yeah, it was called common settings. What am I missing? Here in the topic file, there was a filter. So the content should be filtered for Scratch. And in the library, there is a filter that overrides it and says that this chapter shouldn't go to anything about scratches. Okay, let's just collapse this chapter and see what follows. We got from line 29 to line 619 and nothing follows. End of chunk. So there should be another filter somewhere that overrides it. Oh, here. Scratch. Good. Finally, something under the Scratch filter. Maybe we are getting warmer, but it says main class. I can't see the option we are looking for. It was parallel run. Okay, let's just maybe search for allow parallel run. Oops, nothing. It's not there, damn. Must be another overriding filter somewhere. Okay, maybe just let's search the whole project for that string. Allow parallel run. There is something. There's nothing from a library, so that won't help. Okay, what I'll do, I'll just narrow down the search by this exact sentence and try to search my project for it. Oh, finally one occurrence. Good, another library. We're getting close anyway. So there is another library, and the snippet must be included into that first snippet. Never mind, at least we found the source, and now I can see why I couldn't locate this option name, allow parallel run, because it's not hard-coded, it's taken from the UI properties bundle, so we're just referencing it by ID. Nice. Okay, so here's the grammar error. Actually, the editor highlights it and even suggests a fix. Good. Do I still want to find out how this line got into the final output? No, God forbid. And I really hope I'll never have to restructure its contents and deal with this maze of filters and includes. I'm just happy I have found the source and can fix that error. So why does that happen? Since our company makes developer tools, we work close to developers and write for developers, and we writers tend to adopt developer approaches, and we even author docs in the IDE, as you have seen. So we sometimes get carried away with the beauty and brevity of source code reduced to a single line that actually lets you unveil layers of content behind it like a nesting doll. And if we look back at the list of benefits of single source, let's just quickly test this example against them. Okay, it helps you maintain consistency, as every little bit that can be reused is reused here. For the same reason, it helps you avoid making multiple updates. And you also reduce on localization costs. But this code is hard to read, hard to update, and you increase the review and editing effort. And this code is hard to investigate. And in no way it helps you automate the routine. Because if you are not the original author of these includes and the dependencies between them, you will have to get your way through this maze. And you have seen how complicated it can get to decompose this code. So the buzz factor here is very high, since only the author of the original code will be able to maintain and reuse it. So let's see how we can avoid that. To tell you the truth, this is not something that we at JetBrains are champions at. But as a team, you need to find a balance between reusing everything that could be possibly reused and keeping your code readable and searchable. Remember that just because you can doesn't mean you should. Sometimes you'd better prefer duplication over the wrong abstraction and put up with not 100% reuse, because otherwise you may shoot yourself in the foot by creating source code that is rigid and difficult to maintain and reuse. And the investment you have made into reducing it can never be recovered. Another thing that we're working on is improving user experience. Luckily, we have a super experienced UX designer working on our tool, and we are looking at ways to make source code look like text more than like code. Possible solutions would probably imply showing the contents of the include in the editor as it would appear in the current context with all conditions, filters, and variable values processed and taken into account. We could probably also make it possible to let authors jump to the ultimate source and skip all the intermediate files. And we could improve our global search so that it can handle final values instead of reference keys for things like UI strings. Now, the next bit you can fall into is misuse of reuse. One of the best things about JetBrains IDEs is that they are highly customizable, which means there are a lot of settings with multiple options that let you fine-tune your working environment to make it unique and comfy for you. So you can imagine how many times in our docs we tell users to open the Settings Preferences dialog, go to a specific page, and configure some option. Here's a procedure that tells you how to configure async profiler settings. Look at the first tab that I have highlighted in yellow. It tells you to press a shortcut to open the IDE settings and select Build Execution Deployment Java Profiler. This is a phrase that you probably write several times a week, only the ultimate dialog page being different. So it's only natural that you are tempted to think that if you are repeating yourself so often, you must be doing something wrong, and it makes sense to reuse it. So let's look at the source code and see the underlying code behind the step. We need to look for async profiler. Okay, there it is. By the way, let's see how much is many and how often this is reviewed. So we just search for usages. It yields 218 results. Looks like it's really worth reusing it. So there is this include of a content snippet. Let's jump to the source. Okay, so what we see here is there is another snippet from the same library wrapped into the original include. So in the end, there are like 10 lines of code behind this little sentence. And I'm asking myself, is it really worth it? In software development, there is a principle called DRY. It was formulated as early as in 1999 in a book called The Pragmatic Programmer. DRY here stands for Don't Repeat Yourself, and it is aimed at reducing repetition of software patterns and replacing it with abstractions to avoid redundancy. Just like in programming, this principle is often misunderstood by technical writers who are tempted to reuse anything that potentially could be reused and wrap multiple reusable snippets into one another, thus creating complex markup structures where changing an element breaks the logic for other dependent elements. With all the nested includes and the dependencies between them, this code looks like a tangled ball of yarn. Does it help you maintain consistency? Maybe. Though in this particular example, there is so little you could potentially rephrase, and the price for maintaining this consistency seems too high. It doesn't, though, prevent you from making multiple updates, because only the generalized part is reused, and the meaningful parts are scattered around multiple other snippets. It doesn't help you reduce on the review effort for the same reasons that we have discussed when we were talking about code reduction. This code is very hard to read and update. And last but not least, what about automating the routine? In this specific example, this was the main reason to reuse this phrase, to avoid typing it repeatedly and save yourself from a mundane task. But as a result, content was reused to the point where it became too complex. So what can we do about it? You need to remember that the dry principle doesn't always work. If you strive at achieving perfect reuse, you may end up implementing a tangled ball of dependencies, and it will be very difficult for your teammates to understand and maintain this code. Wikipedia playfully tells you that the opposite of the dry principle is the wet principle. And wet here stands for write every time, or we enjoy typing, or even waste everyone's time. However, I would suggest that the opposite should be the KISS principle, introduced in the 1960s in the US Navy, and it stands for Keep It Simple, Stupid. And this principle states that most systems work best if they are kept simple, rather than made complicated. Also, you can think of other means to achieve your goal. Like in this example, the ultimate goal of the author was to automate a routine task of typing the same phrase. And like in a programming language, there are usually multiple ways to achieve the same goal. In this case, you could, for example, create a template or a completion pattern and assign a hotkey combination to it so that you could paste it with just a couple of keystrokes. Like, for example, in Java, when you type SOUT and it's expanded into the system out printing statement. Wouldn't that be easier for everyone? Now let's talk about the fourth and most intriguing monster, traffic cannibalization. In the previous 4 sections, we talked about the pits that content authors may fall into if they don't weigh the gains of content reuse. This one affects our customers, the people who read technical documentation. Web content cannibalization happens when you pull your audience into more than one direction. And that's exactly what happens when you reuse content and publish identical chunks of it to multiple outputs on the web. Search engines like Google just ignore some of the web pages because identical content already exists on a different page and it's ranked higher in search results. This is an example of a search query. If you look at it, it says multi-carat IntelliJ idea. And what's the top ranked search result? It is the relevant articles that talks about multiple cursors only in JetBrains Writer, a different JetBrains product, and not IntelliJ idea. Because the contents of this article is single-sourced, and for God knows what reasons, Google thinks that the page from Writer documentation is more relevant. Actually, our SEO specialists have helped us identify some of the reasons for traffic cannibalization, though the list may be incomplete. If content is published earlier, it is indexed earlier. So if Writer is released several weeks before IntelliJ idea, chances are high that Google crawlers will have already indexed this article before IntelliJ idea documentation was published. The less content on a page, the better it's indexed. Sometimes documentation authors in our team reuse bits and pieces, but the overall section architecture is different across the instances. That's exactly the case that happened with Writer. The information on multiple carrots was placed in an isolated topic, while in IntelliJ idea it was a chapter in a larger article, so headings containing the keywords were lower level. Also, SEO specialists tell us that more traffic and links to a page from other sources also lead to better ranking. So probably in Writer there were more references to this topic from other articles. So what can we do about it? SEO specialists tell us you can avoid traffic cannibalization only if your content is unique. Now that we've learned about this phenomenon, shall we stop reusing content at all? Obviously not. The gains of single sourcing content are still big. So, my first advice is beware of the thing. To be forewarned is to be forearmed. Just remember, your job isn't done after you have published your content on the web. Well-written documentation has huge marketing potential. So you always need to use all means you have to check that it works, is discoverable and accessible, and take action if needed. When it comes to action, what you can do is you can add metadata. If you are using content snippets and not entire articles, you may embed metadata into your sources containing more keywords to help search engines distinguish between different target outputs. You can schedule updates to make sure that different documentation instances that contain new content are not published with weeks-long intervals between them. You may agree in your team on the optimal article length so that the same content doesn't appear on different nesting levels in different documentation deliverables. And sometimes you may want to use other means to distinguish between different types of content. For example, let me show you this web page. It's installation instructions for IntelliJ IDEA on different operating systems. And here you could create separate articles telling users how to install IntelliJ IDEA or Windows, Mac, also Linux. And each of them would contain some references to reused content. This would literally be pulling the audience into different directions with almost identical content. And most likely search engines would rank the most visited page higher, depending on which operating system is more popular among IntelliJ IDEA users. Instead, you could break this content into tabs to make sure that readers land on the same page and will be able to quickly navigate to the instructions that they need. So, let us summarize the conclusions that we have made at JetBrains after about 10 years of shooting ourselves in the feet and falling into old traps of reusing content. Whenever you make a decision about reusing some content, always weigh the benefits. Check yourself against the benefits list and make sure that you are making your or your colleague's life easier with this decision and it's worth the trouble. Be careful about creating dependencies between reusable chunks of content that apply complex logic. Aim to create standalone reusable chunks whose logic won't be broken by a slight change to a parent snippet or a modification to a pile of filters overriding each other. Strike a balance between reusing content and keeping sources readable and maintainable. Remember that just because you can doesn't mean you should. Don't misinterpret the dry principle and sometimes sacrifice perfect reuse to a simpler solution. Ask yourself which problem you are trying to solve with content reuse. And maybe you will find out that there are other, simpler solutions to your problem. Think of our examples about automating the routine work by creating templates, or configuring completion patterns, or splitting similar content across tabs instead of putting it in the different articles. And finally, remember that your job isn't done when content is published to the web. Always check that it is discoverable after you make any major changes or publish anything new. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if your content is useful if readers don't get to it, right? That's all from me. I hope this was useful and that my little tips would probably save your feet for better things like walking in the meadows. And now I'm ready to answer your questions if you have any.